Outlaws kidnap rancher's wife, only to realize she's the most feared gunslinger in the desolate stretches of the Arizona desert. There was a man named Hank Donovan, a grizzled rancher who owned a sprawling piece of land that stretched out beneath the unforgiving sun. His cattle were worth a small fortune, and his homestead was well known among locals as a place of safety, but it wasn't the ranch itself that made Hank famous. No, it was his wife, Emma. Emma Donovan wasn't a typical rancher's wife. She wasn't the soft-spoken, sweet-tempered lady that you might expect to see baking bread or tending to animals in a quiet country home. Emma had a past so dark that Hank didn't dare ask too many questions. What Hank did know was that his wife had once been known as the Widowmaker, a name that struck fear into the hearts of even the most hardened criminals. Before meeting Hank, Emma had been a notorious bounty hunter, the kind of woman who could outdraw and outshoot any man in the West. She had a reputation that made even the most fearless men quake in their boots. But when she married Hank, she buried that life, retreating into the quiet, peaceful existence of a rancher's wife. Or so it seemed. It was late one evening when the Outlaws came. Led by the infamous Quinn brothers, a notorious gang who had been wreaking havoc across the region, they had heard rumors of the wealth that Hank Donovan possessed. They thought that by kidnapping his wife, they could hold her for ransom and force Hank to pay a hefty sum to get her back. Little did they know, they were about to make a grave mistake. Under the cover of night, the Quinn brothers and their gang rode up to the Donovan ranch. Quietly, they snuck into the house, easily overpowering the ranch's few hired hands. They stormed into the bedroom, where Emma slept, and before she could fully wake, they had bound her hands and thrown her onto the back of one of their horses. "Get up, lady," one of the outlaws sneered, shaking her roughly awake. "You're coming with us." Emma didn't struggle. She merely smiled, the kind of smile that made even the hardiest of men uneasy. The leader, a burly man named Colt Quinn, grabbed her roughly by the arm and yanked her to her feet. "You better behave, lady," Colt growled. "We'll be making a deal with your husband real soon. He won't dare try to stop us when we make our demands." Emma didn't say a word. She simply nodded as if she was too tired to care. The gang led her out of the house and toward the horses, where they tied her to one of the animals before taking off into the night. As they rode through the desert, the gang began to talk amongst themselves, making plans for the ransom. They were sure Hank would pay whatever they asked for Emma's safe return. After all, she was just a woman, wasn't she? But as they ventured further into the wilderness, Emma began to stir. She could hear their voices growing quieter as they went deeper into the desert, and when she finally felt the time was right, she acted. Without warning, Emma slipped free from the ropes that bound her hands, the result of years of training and discipline. She didn't need to look to know where the guns were. They were exactly where she'd left them, strapped to her body in the most unconventional way. The men hadn't bothered to disarm her, assuming she was too helpless to be any threat. In a blur of motion, Emma drew her revolver faster than a rattlesnake strikes. Before anyone could react, two outlaws were on the ground, blood pouring from their chests. Colt Quinn turned in horror, but it was too late. Emma was already on him, the barrel of her gun pressed into his forehead before he could even reach for his own weapon. "You made a mistake," Emma said coldly, her voice dripping with venom. "You should have killed me when you had the chance." Colt, his face pale and trembling, raised his hands in surrender. We didn't know who you were," he stammered. "We thought you were just a rancher's wife." Emma narrowed her eyes. "A lot of people think that, but the truth is, I'm the last person you should have ever crossed." With a smooth, practiced motion, she holstered her gun and untied herself from the horse. The remaining outlaws were staring at her in disbelief. They had all heard the rumors, of course. The tales of the Widowmaker had traveled through the saloons, whispered in hushed tones around campfires, and spoken in fearful respect among those who knew the true cost of crossing her path. But they had never truly believed it. Until now. "Now, you're going to walk back to that ranch," Emma ordered, her voice deadly calm. "And when you get there, you're going to tell your gang that Emma Donovan is not someone to mess with. Got it?" The outlaws nodded frantically, their faces pale with fear. They were completely at her mercy, and they knew it. The ride back to the ranch was a long, tense one. As they reached the outskirts of the property, Emma gave a final, disdainful glance at the men. "Get off my land," she spat. "And if I ever see your faces again, it won't be pretty." The outlaws didn't need any more encouragement. They scrambled away as quickly as their legs could carry them, leaving Emma standing alone in the dust. She didn't need to wait long before Hank rode up to her. His face was a mixture of relief and awe as he dismounted and rushed to her side. "Emma, you're all right?" Hank exclaimed, his voice full of emotion. Emma just smiled, but it wasn't a smile of joy. It was the kind of smile that made Hank shiver with understanding. "I'm fine," she said, "but next time, Hank, we might want to make sure that nobody forgets who I really am." As they rode back to the ranch, Hank looked at his wife, his heart swelling with pride. He had always known she was capable, but seeing her in action, the woman he loved, the woman who had buried her past for him, was something he would never forget. And the Quinn brothers? They learned the hard way that even the most feared outlaws could never predict who they were really messing with. Emma Donovan, the Widowmaker, was not someone to be underestimated. Not now, not ever. In the days that followed, things seemed to settle back into the quiet rhythm of ranch life. Hank tried to convince himself that the ordeal was over, that the danger had passed. But Emma knew better. She always did. The dust had barely settled after the Quinn brothers' humiliating retreat when Emma began to hear whispers. Whispers of another gang. One that was even more dangerous, more ruthless than the Quinns. This new gang was led by a man named Clay Graveyard Grant, a former outlaw with a reputation for leaving nothing but death and ruin in his wake. It was said that he had crossed paths with Emma before, and he had never forgiven her for the public humiliation she'd handed him years ago. While Hank was working on repairing the fences, Emma's sharp ears caught a faint, familiar sound. Hoofbeats, not far off. She had been expecting this for days. The quiet that had settled over the ranch was only the calm before the storm. Her intuition was never wrong. When Hank came in for lunch, Emma sat at the table, her mind elsewhere. He noticed the faraway look in her eyes and the way her fingers absent-mindedly traced the edge of her rifle, which always rested beside her chair. Hank knew something was coming, but he didn't want to admit it, not after the scare they just had with the Quinn brothers. "Emma," Hank began, his voice soft but serious. "What is it?" She met his gaze, her eyes cold but filled with the same resolve she always had. "It's him, the one who never forgets." The door creaked open suddenly, and Emma's senses went on high alert. Without a word, she stood and walked toward the door, the leather of her boots silent against the wooden floor. Hank followed closely behind, not sure whether he should be worried or if his wife was just being overly cautious. Outside, just beyond the dusty road leading up to the ranch, there was a figure. A man on horseback, tall and broad-shouldered, silhouetted against the fading light of the evening sky. His presence alone made the air feel thicker, as though the very desert itself held its breath. It was Clay Grant. "Emma Donovan," Clay called, his voice as rough as gravel, carrying across the wind like a warning. "I should have known you'd be here. You've always had a knack for hiding in plain sight." Emma stepped forward, her posture straight, her hand still resting on the hilt of her revolver. "What do you want, Grant?" He chuckled darkly, swinging down from his horse with a grace that belied his brutish appearance. His men followed suit, a group of hardened outlaws who had seen more bloodshed than most could stomach. The only thing that stood out more than their ferocity was the coldness in their eyes. "I'm here to make you an offer," Clay said, his voice smooth, like a predator toying with its prey. "You and me, we could rule this desert. Leave your husband, leave all of this behind, and join me. There's no reason for you to hide out here in the middle of nowhere. You've got a reputation, Emma. I think you know what I mean." Emma's jaw clenched. She knew exactly what he meant. Grant had a way of twisting people to his will, seducing them with power and promises of riches. But Emma had learned long ago that those promises were nothing more than lies wrapped in velvet. "I'm not interested in your offer, Grant," she replied coldly, her eyes narrowing. "And if you've come here for anything else, you'll leave in the same manner." Grant smirked. You always were a stubborn one. But don't think you can just walk away from me. I've got a score to settle. You humiliated me once, and I've waited a long time for this moment." Before Hank could step forward, Emma raised a hand to stop him. She knew her husband well enough to understand his protective instincts, but this was her fight. And in the world they lived in, there were only two ways it could end: on their feet or on their backs. "You think you can take me down, Clay? You and your boys?" Emma said, her voice low and filled with the kind of deadly calm that only someone who had stared death in the face could possess. "I've buried men who were far worse than you." Clay's eyes flashed with a dangerous gleam, but he was no fool. He knew he wasn't dealing with a mere rancher's wife anymore. He had underestimated her once, and now that mistake would cost him dearly. "We'll see about that," he snarled, motioning to his men. They drew their guns, but Emma was faster. The sound of gunfire shattered the silence of the desert as Emma moved like lightning, her revolver flashing from its holster with the precision of a snake striking. The first two outlaws fell before they even realized what was happening. Grant's men hesitated for only a second, but that was all Emma needed. She fired again, and a third outlaw crumpled to the ground. Hank stood frozen for a moment, awestruck by the speed and deadly accuracy with which his wife moved. But his shock was quickly replaced with a surge of pride. This wasn't the quiet, docile woman he had married. This was the Widowmaker, the legendary gunslinger. Clay Grant, realizing that he was losing control, reached for his own gun. But it was already too late. Emma had anticipated his move, and in a split second, her bullet found its mark, striking Grant's hand and sending his revolver skidding across the dirt. He staggered back, clutching his wrist in pain, and stared at Emma, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. You were the Widowmaker?" he gasped. "I thought you were just a myth." Emma's lips curled into a cold smile. "Myth or not, you're still alive, which is more than I can say for your men." Grant, now backed into a corner, was left with only one choice: retreat. With a muttered curse, he scrambled to his feet and signaled to the remaining outlaws. "This isn't over, Emma," he hissed. "I'll be back for you. For both of you." But Emma wasn't worried. As Grant and his men fled into the desert night, she turned to Hank, who was still in shock, his mouth agape. "You were right," he said, his voice filled with awe. "I never knew the full story of who you were. I should have trusted you more." Emma gave him a tired smile, holstering her revolver. "The past is a dangerous thing, Hank, but I've learned to live with it. And it's going to take more than a few outlaws to shake my foundation." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the Donovans knew that this fight was far from over. But for now, they had each other, and that was enough. Together, they could face anything. Days passed after the confrontation with Clay Grant and his gang. Though Emma had successfully driven them off, she could feel the tension hanging in the air like a thunderstorm waiting to break. It wasn't just the threat of another attack. It was the reality that Grant would not give up. He had made his intentions clear, and he had a personal vendetta against her that would drive him to any lengths. Hank did his best to keep the ranch running, but the fear that had gripped them both after the encounter was hard to shake. Emma knew she had to put an end to it once and for all. She couldn't live in constant fear of the past coming back to haunt them, and she couldn't let Hank, who had nothing to do with her old life, be dragged into it any further. The only way to make it stop was to confront it head-on. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the ranch, Emma turned to Hank, her eyes steady and resolute. "I'm going after him. For good." Hank looked at her, the weight of the decision sinking in. "You don't have to do this, Emma. We can leave. Start over somewhere new." Emma shook her head, her expression unwavering. "It's not about starting over. It's about finishing what I started. I've spent too many years running from my past. This is the only way to end it." She could see the worry in Hank's eyes, but there was also understanding. He knew that she was right. Emma had always been a force of nature, and though he hated the danger she faced, he loved her strength. "Be careful, Emma," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Come back to me." "I will," she promised, her voice filled with the same cold confidence that had carried her through so many battles before. That night, Emma packed only the essentials. A few days' worth of supplies, a spare revolver, and of course, her prized Winchester rifle, her most trusted companion. As she saddled her horse and prepared to leave, Hank came out to the barn, his face shadowed by the light of a lantern. "You sure about this?" Hank asked, his voice a mix of concern and admiration. Emma paused, glancing over her shoulder at him. "It's the only way. I'll end it. I promise you, Hank. I'm not just going after Clay Grant. I'm going to bury this part of my life for good." With a final nod, Hank stepped forward, taking her hand and squeezing it. "Then you'd better be the last one standing when it's over." Emma's lips curved into a brief smile, her heart heavy but resolute. She mounted her horse, and with a final glance at Hank, she rode off into the night, her silhouette disappearing into the dark horizon. For days, Emma tracked Clay Grant's gang across the desert. She knew their habits, their hiding spots, and their tactics. They wouldn't be easy to find, but Emma was patient. She had a singular focus: to make sure Grant never threatened her, Hank, or anyone else again. Eventually, she found them. They had set up camp in a narrow canyon, a place surrounded by jagged rocks where they thought they were safe. But Emma knew better. The moment she saw their campfire flickering in the distance, she knew it was time. With the shadows of the canyon stretching long and dark behind her, Emma prepared herself. She took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. This wasn't just a shootout. It was the final reckoning. She was going to make sure that the past would stay buried where it belonged. She dismounted and crept silently towards the camp, using the terrain to stay hidden. The outlaws were gathered around the fire, laughing and talking. Clay Grant, sitting at the center, had no idea what was coming. Emma's eyes narrowed as she scanned the scene. Sizing up the men, she knew she wouldn't get a better chance. With a slow, deliberate movement, she pulled her revolver from its holster and took aim. The shot rang out, echoing off the canyon walls. The first outlaw went down before he even knew what hit him. The others scrambled for their guns, but Emma was already on them, moving with lethal precision. She shot 2 more men before they could even react. Her movement so fast and fluid it was as if the bullets came from nowhere. Grant leapt to his feet, his face twisted in rage and disbelief. "Emma!" he roared, drawing his gun. "You're going to pay for this." He fired blindly, but Emma was already moving. She ducked behind a boulder, her heart racing, and then peeked around the edge. In that split second, Grant saw her. His eyes were wild, filled with the kind of fury that only a man with a personal grudge could have. "Come out, Emma!" he shouted, his voice echoing in the canyon. "I'll kill you." Emma didn't answer. She just waited, watching him through the scope of her rifle, waiting for the perfect moment. Grant was distracted for a split second, looking to his men as if he expected them to come to his aid. That's when Emma made her move. She rose from behind the rock and took aim. Grant turned just as the bullet struck him square in the chest. He staggered back, his gun falling from his hand as he collapsed onto the ground. No, this can't be the end," he rasped, his voice weak as blood pooled beneath him. Emma stood there, her face impassive, watching him with cold eyes. She had always known that this day would come, but now that it had, she felt nothing but the quiet satisfaction of having finished what had started all those years ago. She didn't say a word. She turned and began walking back toward her horse, her heart heavy but relieved. Emma returned to the ranch a few days later, tired but victorious. The sun was just beginning to rise as she rode up to the house, the first rays of light catching the dust that clung to her clothes. Hank was waiting for her, standing on the porch with a look of concern that quickly melted into relief as he saw her approach. He stepped forward to meet her, his eyes searching her face for signs of what had happened. "It's done," Emma said softly, her voice steady, though her body was exhausted. "Grant's gone. For good." Hank nodded, pulling her into his arms. "I knew you'd come back to me." "I always will," Emma whispered. "This life, it's not easy, Hank. But as long as I have you, I can face anything." And as they stood together on the porch, with the desert sun rising behind them, Emma Donovan knew that, at long last, the past had been put to rest, and her future, whatever it might hold, was now hers to shape.